Jack sat at the kitchen table in his new home, staring at the bare walls and boxes stacked in every corner. Moving was exhausting enough, but the real weight of it didn't hit him until now, in the stillness of a house that didn't yet feel like his. All for a promotion, he reminded himself. A promising job in a new city, a chance to grow. But as he looked around, he felt a tug of regret. Their cozy little house in Boston felt a million miles away, filled with warm memories and familiar nooks that now seemed like they belonged to a different life. Sitting across from him, Susan looked remarkably different. She seemed lighter, like a weight had been lifted from her. She'd been excited about the move from the start, thrilled by the idea of starting fresh in a place neither of them knew. But Jack could already see the strain in her eyes after just a few weeks. He thought it was just the stress of moving. But maybe there was something else too. The silence settled heavily between them. Jack reached for his coffee, studying her as she scrolled through her phone absently, her face illuminated by the cold glow of the screen. There was a time when she would have filled this silence with chatter, excited plans, little daydreams. But tonight, she seemed lost in her own thoughts, and Jack couldn't shake the feeling that those thoughts didn't include him. "Are you okay?" he asked, breaking the silence. His voice sounded strange in the empty kitchen. Susan looked up, her expression unreadable for a second before she forced a smile. "Yeah, just adjusting. It's weird being somewhere so new." "Weird is right," Jack agreed, glancing out the window at their dimly lit street. The neighborhood was picturesque, rows of houses with neat lawns and clean sidewalks, everything just as polished as in a real estate brochure. But it lacked the soul, the personality, that made a place feel like home. In the morning, the sun was harsh and unfamiliar, and at night, it was eerily quiet. He felt a pang of guilt. He'd pushed for this job, convinced it would be the best thing for them. More money, more stability, everything they'd talked about building together. But now that they were here, he wondered if he'd misjudged things. It wasn't the life they dreamed up over late-night talks in their Boston apartment. It was new, and maybe it could be something great. But right now, it just felt cold. Susan's phone buzzed with a notification, and she quickly glanced at it before setting it back on the table, face down. Jack noticed it. How could he not? And felt a faint flicker of unease. He pushed it down. Paranoia wasn't going to help anyone. Besides, he had plenty of work to do before he could even think about putting down roots here. "Maybe we should go for a walk?" he suggested. "Get a feel for the neighborhood." Susan's face brightened at the suggestion, and Jack felt a small surge of relief. "Yeah, that sounds nice." They strolled through the streets together, side by side, but somehow feeling further apart than they ever had before. The neighborhood was almost too perfect, like something out of a catalog. White picket fences, neatly trimmed lawns, and quiet porches with wind chimes that tinkled softly in the breeze. The only movement came from a few people out walking their dogs, nodding politely as they passed. Jack tried to engage Susan in conversation, pointing out small things he liked about the area, but she was mostly quiet, lost in her own thoughts. As they turned a corner, Jack noticed a figure leaning casually against a car in a driveway a few houses down. He was young, maybe in his early 30s, with dark hair and a sharp jawline. He wore a leather jacket and jeans, standing out against the polished suburban backdrop like a misplaced character in a film. As they walked past, he looked up and locked eyes with Susan, holding her gaze just a second longer than polite. "Evening," he said, nodding at them with a slight smile. Susan offered a faint smile in return, her gaze lingering on him for just a moment before they moved on. Jack noticed it, the way she glanced back, just for a second, before returning her attention to the street ahead. "That must be one of our neighbors," he said, trying to sound casual, though he felt a strange prickling at the back of his neck. "I guess so," Susan replied lightly, though Jack could see the hint of a smile playing at the corners of her mouth. They walked back in silence, the encounter hanging between them like a shadow neither wanted to acknowledge. When they reached home, Susan headed upstairs to unpack a few more boxes, leaving Jack alone in the kitchen once again. He sat there, staring at the blank walls and wondering if he was reading too much into things. The way Susan's smile lingered, her quiet mood, the unfamiliar man next door. But he couldn't shake the feeling that something had shifted, something subtle but undeniable. And as he sat there, he knew he couldn't ignore it. Jack had barely settled into his new routine when he noticed Susan spending more time outdoors, taking walks or standing on their porch with her morning coffee. She seemed to have developed a sudden interest in the neighborhood, an interest he'd rarely seen back in Boston. Every now and then, as Jack left for work, he'd catch a glimpse of her talking to the neighbors, smiling and waving as he drove off. It was nice to see her enjoying the new place, or so he told himself, hoping that her newfound enthusiasm would keep her happy until he could spend more time at home. It wasn't long, though, before Jack started noticing one particular neighbor that Susan seemed especially friendly with, the man they'd passed on their first walk, with the leather jacket and quiet, self-assured air. He was young, maybe a few years younger than Jack, with a sculpted look that seemed slightly out of place in this calm, suburban world. Jack didn't even know his name, but every time he came home, he'd find him there, chatting with Susan, leaning against his car, and giving Jack a quick nod as he passed, as if they were both in on some unspoken understanding. One evening, Jack came home a little earlier than usual. He'd been thinking about Susan all day, feeling guilty for all the long hours he'd been putting in. He wanted to surprise her, maybe take her out for dinner, and reconnect. But as he walked up the path to their house, he saw her on the driveway, talking to the neighbor. They stood close, not quite touching, but something in their body language caught his attention. The way she laughed, her hand touching her hair, was too familiar, too open. It was a laugh he hadn't heard directed at him in weeks. Jack cleared his throat as he approached. "Hey, Susan," he said, keeping his tone light, though he couldn't hide the tension in his voice. "Who's this?" Susan turned, her smile fading slightly. "Jack, you're home early," she said, with a hint of surprise in her voice. "This is Ryan. He lives next door." Ryan extended his hand, flashing a casual grin. "Hey man, good to finally meet you. Susan's told me a lot about you." Jack shook his hand, his grip a little firmer than usual. "Is that so?" Susan laughed awkwardly. "Just the usual neighborly stuff," she said, her eyes darting between the two men. Ryan held his gaze for a moment, his smile never faltering. "Well, it's nice to see you around. I told Susan if you guys ever need anything, I'm right next door. Always happy to help out." Jack forced a polite smile, but there was something about Ryan's tone that grated on him. "Thanks," he replied curtly. "I appreciate it." As Ryan sauntered back to his own driveway, Jack turned to Susan. "I didn't realize you were getting so friendly with the neighbors." Susan rolled her eyes. "Come on, Jack. He's just being polite. It's nice to have someone to talk to during the day, you know?" Jack took a breath, trying to keep his frustration in check. "Sure, but I don't know. Something about him seems a little too friendly." Susan sighed, crossing her arms. "He's harmless, Jack. Don't overthink it." But Jack couldn't shake the feeling of discomfort that settled over him. The look in Ryan's eyes, the way he seemed a little too interested in Susan, wasn't something he could ignore. Over the next few weeks, Jack's unease grew. He'd come home to find Susan in different moods, sometimes distant, other times strangely cheerful. She'd mention Ryan here and there, always in passing, as if to downplay his presence in her day-to-day life. "Oh, Ryan helped me carry some groceries," she'd say casually, or Ryan recommended this great coffee shop downtown. It wasn't long before Jack began feeling like an outsider in his own home. He'd lie awake at night, listening to Susan's steady breathing beside him, wondering what she was really thinking. Their conversations felt forced, stilted, like they were trying to hold onto something that was slipping through their fingers. And through it all, Ryan seemed to linger on the edges, an invisible presence that grew stronger with every mention of his name. One night, Jack finally decided to confront Susan. He'd come home late, exhausted from work, only to find the house empty. His pulse quickened, his thoughts racing as he glanced at the clock. It was almost 9, and she hadn't mentioned going out. After a few anxious minutes, he heard the familiar sound of her footsteps on the front porch. Susan walked in, looking flustered. "Oh, you're still up?" she said, trying to act casual. "Where were you?" Jack asked, his voice tight. "Just out for a walk," she replied, avoiding his gaze. "Needed some fresh air." "With Ryan?" The words came out before he could stop himself. Susan frowned, finally meeting his eyes. What's that supposed to mean? Jack took a step back, forcing himself to keep calm. It just seems like you've been spending a lot of time with him. Jack, he's a neighbor, she replied sharply, her voice rising. He's been friendly, and I'm just being polite. You're the one who's always gone, busy with work. I need someone to talk to. The accusation stung, and Jack struggled to find the right words. He wanted to explain himself, to tell her that he was just trying to build a better future for them, that he missed her just as much. But the words caught in his throat, and Susan brushed past him, heading upstairs without another word. Jack stood there, alone in the quiet house, his chest tight with a mixture of anger, frustration, and a growing sense of dread. He'd pushed for this move, convinced that it would be the best thing for them. But now he couldn't help but wonder if he'd made a terrible mistake. And somewhere in the back of his mind, he couldn't shake the feeling that Ryan was more than just a friendly neighbor. As the silence settled around him, Jack made a decision. He wasn't going to ignore it anymore. If there was something going on, he would find out. Jack's suspicions gnawed at him, day after day, until he could barely concentrate at work. Ryan's presence loomed like a dark cloud over his marriage, and the once happy home he'd built with Susan felt like it was crumbling. Every time he walked through the door, he'd feel a strange tension hanging in the air, a faint scent of something unspoken lingering between them. Susan had become more elusive, slipping out for walks or errands without much explanation, her phone always close, her smile just a little too guarded. Then one evening, Jack decided he couldn't take it any longer. He needed to know. The possibility was tearing him apart, and though the answer might devastate him, it was better than the quiet torment of not knowing. As soon as Susan left for her usual evening walk, Jack moved quickly, almost in a trance, his fingers steady as he retrieved a small hidden camera he'd purchased online. He felt a pang of guilt even holding it, but desperation had driven him to this. With quick, purposeful movements, he set up the device discreetly near the front door, angled to capture anyone coming or going. Over the next week, he would sit in the darkened living room, waiting, his nerves stretched thin. He'd replay the footage late at night when he couldn't sleep, his heart racing as he fast-forwarded through hours of mundane scenes. Susan moving about the house, the door occasionally opening and closing. Each time, he watched and waited, trying to catch a glimpse of something, anything that would confirm his fears. And then one evening, he saw it. Susan slipped out of the house and walked toward Ryan's place with a familiar ease, as if it were routine. Jack felt his heart plummet, his fingers tightening into fists as he watched her approach Ryan's garage. They exchanged a few words, glancing around cautiously, and then she disappeared inside. For a few moments, Jack just sat there, stunned, staring at the screen. He wanted to look away, to tell himself that it was some misunderstanding, that he wasn't seeing what he thought he was seeing. But there was no denying it anymore. His wife, his Susan, was having an affair. And as he replayed the footage, watching her enter Ryan's garage like a lover slipping into a forbidden world, his anger boiled over. It wasn't just betrayal. It was the ease with which she lied, the routine nature of it, as if he were nothing more than a shadow in her life. The following day, he decided he needed to see it with his own eyes. He waited until Susan had her next walk, but this time, he told her he was heading out of town for a business trip. She hardly reacted, barely even looked up from her phone as he announced his departure. He felt a pang of resentment. Was she even pretending to care anymore? He drove around the block, parking his car where he could watch Ryan's house without being seen. He kept his distance, hiding in the shadows, waiting. Finally, he saw her, Susan, walking briskly down the street, slipping into Ryan's garage without a second thought. Jack clenched his jaw, his heart pounding as he waited for the right moment. Minutes passed, then an hour, and Jack's patience wore thin. He felt like he was on the edge of a cliff, ready to jump, his anger surging with each ticking second. Unable to bear it any longer, he made his way to the garage door, his footsteps quiet but purposeful. He paused just outside, taking a steadying breath, and then he pushed the door open. Inside, he found them, tangled together, lost in each other, completely unaware of his presence. The sight of Susan with another man, her body so familiar yet so distant, drove a spike of rage and despair through him. They both looked up, shocked, frozen in place as they registered his presence. The silence that followed was thick, suffocating, as they scrambled to separate themselves, the guilt evident in their eyes. "Jack," Susan whispered, her voice barely audible. She looked at him with a mix of horror and shame, but he saw something else too, a strange defiance, as if she didn't fully regret what she'd done. Jack felt the words building up inside him, accusations, questions, all jumbled and chaotic, but in the end, all he managed was a single, raw question. "Why?" Susan stared at him, her face a mask of conflicted emotions. "Jack, I needed something more. I was lonely. You were never here, always working, always somewhere else." Her voice was cold, defensive, like she was already blaming him for her own betrayal. Jack's anger flared. "So this is my fault?" He spat, his voice shaking. "You think sneaking around with him is somehow my fault?" Ryan stood there, silent, his eyes cast downward, unwilling to meet Jack's gaze. Jack's fists clenched, his knuckles white as he fought the urge to throw a punch, to unleash every ounce of his fury on the man who'd taken his wife from him. But he held back, forcing himself to take a step back, to breathe. "I can't even look at you right now," he said, his voice low and hard. He turned and stormed out of the garage, leaving Susan and Ryan behind, the silence of the night swallowing him as he walked away. That night, Jack didn't go home. He wandered through the quiet streets, his mind reeling, every step feeling like he was moving further from the life he once knew. The betrayal had shattered him, and the woman he'd once loved felt like a stranger. But amidst the hurt, a new resolve began to form within him. He would uncover the truth behind Susan's actions, whatever it took. And if this was the end of their marriage, then he would make sure she understood the depth of the pain she'd caused him. In the days following the confrontation, Jack felt like a ghost drifting through his own life. He moved mechanically through his work, his mind clouded with images of Susan and Ryan. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw them together, a looping, torturous reel he couldn't escape. He barely ate, barely slept, consumed by a gnawing rage that simmered just beneath the surface. Susan had tried to speak with him, leaving messages and tearful voicemails, but Jack wasn't ready to listen. He needed clarity, needed to process the betrayal that had shattered his trust. But one thing was clear, he wasn't ready to let it slide. If Susan was going to choose this path, he'd make sure she understood the weight of her choices. And so, he decided on his next move. Late one evening, Jack drove home, his stomach tight with the plan he'd put into motion. He parked down the street, out of sight, and quietly slipped into the house. He knew Susan would be out, probably with Ryan. At least, that's what he hoped. The thought twisted in his gut, but he pushed it aside, his resolve hardening. It was time to gather proof, something undeniable that would force Susan to confront what she was doing. He had already set up cameras in a few strategic places around the house, hidden well enough to avoid detection. But this time, he went a step further, planting a discreet camera in the hallway closet where he knew Susan usually kept her purse. If she brought Ryan over, he wanted every angle covered. As he adjusted the lens, he felt a pang of regret, of guilt for invading their privacy in such a way. But it was outweighed by the bitter need for closure, for justice, even if it came at a personal cost. Once he was satisfied with the setup, Jack left the house and drove away, circling the block a few times until he found a discreet place to park. From there, he had a clear view of the house, waiting in the shadows like a hunter, his nerves stretched thin with anticipation. The hours dragged on, each passing minute feeling like an eternity as he waited, heart pounding, hoping for, and dreading what he might see. Just after midnight, he saw her. Susan, walking up the driveway, her form illuminated by the street lamp. She looked around cautiously before unlocking the door and slipping inside. Jack's jaw clenched, anger bubbling up as he watched her walk into their home with such familiarity, as if everything were perfectly normal. A few minutes later, another figure approached. It was Ryan. Jack's hands tightened around the steering wheel, his mind racing as he watched Ryan saunter up to the house, casually checking his phone as he went. Jack's breath quickened, his anger pulsing with every step Ryan took towards his front door. He felt a visceral urge to rush in, to confront them both right then and there, but he forced himself to wait. There would be time for confrontation, for all the things he needed to say, but not yet. First, he needed to let this play out, to gather the final piece of the puzzle. Inside, the camera captured every detail. Ryan entering the house, the low murmurs of their voices blending together, laughter mixed with whispers, the sounds of footsteps moving down the hallway. Jack's heart ached as he watched them together, their voices intimate and close, like they shared some secret language that had once belonged to him and Susan. But then, finally, came the moment he'd been waiting for. The voices faded, replaced by the sound of the bedroom door closing. Jack gritted his teeth, forcing himself to breathe, to stay calm as he waited for the footage to record. He knew it would be difficult to watch later, but he needed every moment preserved, every proof of her betrayal etched into the digital memory of the camera. After what felt like an eternity, Ryan left, slipping out the front door without a trace, just as easily as he'd come in. Jack watched him go, watched the way he disappeared into the night, leaving behind a home that was no longer the sanctuary it had once been. He waited until Susan had gone to bed, until the house was shrouded in silence, before he made his move. The next morning, he played back the footage, bracing himself as he watched it unfold. His heart sank, his worst fears confirmed with every frame, but a cold resolve took hold of him. He copied the video to a USB drive, slipping it into his pocket. It was the evidence he needed, the unvarnished truth he would present to Susan. Later that evening, he returned home and found her in the kitchen, preparing dinner as if everything were perfectly normal. The scent of spices filled the air, but it felt hollow, meaningless, like a thin disguise covering up the reality of their fractured marriage. "Hey," she greeted him with a cautious smile, glancing up from the cutting board. "I thought you were staying late tonight." Jack met her gaze, his face impassive. "Plans changed," he replied evenly, reaching into his pocket. His fingers closed around the USB drive, the tiny object holding all the weight of his broken trust. "Susan," he said, his voice low and controlled, "we need to talk." She looked up, her expression flickering with worry. "What's wrong?" Without a word, he placed the USB drive on the counter, letting it speak for itself. Susan's eyes dropped to the drive, her face paling as she realized what it meant. "Jack, what is this?" she asked, her voice trembling. "You know exactly what it is," he replied, his voice steady but laced with anger. "Everything you've been hiding, everything you thought I wouldn't find out. It's all right here." For a moment, she stood there, stunned, her eyes wide with fear and guilt. She opened her mouth to speak, to offer some excuse or apology, but the words never came. Instead, she lowered her gaze, her shoulders slumping as the weight of her actions settled over her. "Jack, I'm sorry," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "Sorry." Jack's voice cracked with bitterness. "Sorry doesn't change what you did. You lied to me. You betrayed me. And for what? A fling with the guy next door?" Susan's face contorted with shame, but there was a glint of something else, too, a flicker of defiance, as if she still believed her actions were somehow justified. "You were never here, Jack," she said quietly. "I was lonely. You were so focused on work, on your own goals, that you didn't even see me anymore." Jack's chest tightened, a surge of anger mixing with the sting of her words. "So that's your excuse? Because I worked to give us a better life? You decided it was fine to throw it all away?" Susan opened her mouth, but he cut her off, shaking his head. "I can't do this, Susan. I can't pretend everything's okay when you've torn us apart." Without another word, he turned and walked out, leaving her standing in the dim kitchen, her face stricken with regret and anger. Jack had barely stepped out the front door before Susan caught up with him, her footsteps quick and determined. The dusk was falling, casting a cool, shadowed light across the front yard, and for a moment they just stood there in silence, neither one willing to be the first to break it. "Jack," she said finally, her voice strained but steady, I think you owe me a chance to explain. Explain what? Jack snapped, bitterness sharp in his voice. Explain how you betrayed me? Or how you walked into his garage like it was nothing? Like our life, our home, meant nothing? Her face twisted, and he could see the flicker of pain, but it was quickly replaced by defiance. I didn't go looking for this, Jack, but you left me alone. Every day, every night, it was just me. You were always off chasing something, and I was left here, just waiting. Jack felt the anger bubble up, sharper, hotter than before. You think I was doing this all for myself? You think I wanted to leave you alone? I was working so we could have a future, so we could actually build something together. But clearly, you found something more important right next door. Susan sighed heavily, rubbing her hands together as if she could scrub away the guilt. Maybe I wanted to feel something again, Jack. You don't see it, but you've been distant for months. I've felt like a ghost in this house, like I was invisible to you. And then Ryan, he noticed me. He made me feel alive again. Jack closed his eyes, shaking his head. It was hard to believe that this was really happening, that the woman he'd built a life with, the woman he'd once trusted implicitly, was standing here now, justifying what she'd done. So that's it? I didn't give you enough attention, so you turned to him? And you really think that excuses what you did? Her voice softened, almost pleading. I know I made a mistake, Jack. I know. But this wasn't just about him. It was about us. Somewhere along the way, we lost each other, and I didn't know how to fix it. Jack's frustration was only growing. You didn't know how to fix it, so you threw it all away? He paused, the weight of her words settling in. If you wanted to fix it, you could have talked to me. You could have told me how you were feeling instead of going behind my back. Tears welled in Susan's eyes, and she looked down, guilt and regret etched into her face. But as the silence stretched, a strange determination appeared in her expression. She looked back up at him, meeting his gaze head-on. Jack, maybe we both made mistakes, but I'm tired of feeling like I'm the only one to blame here. He laughed bitterly, incredulously. You think this is on me, too? Because I worked late, because I was trying to give us a life, this is somehow my fault? Maybe it is, she replied, her voice steady but quiet. Maybe if you'd been around more, we wouldn't be here right now. Her words hit him like a slap, cutting deep, and for a moment he was speechless. He had never imagined that she could turn this around, make it feel as though the cracks in their marriage were somehow his doing. But as the anger pulsed through him, he realized that part of him wanted to fight, wanted to shout back, to make her see the hurt she had caused him. Yet he knew it wouldn't change anything. You know what, Susan, he said finally, his voice barely above a whisper. Believe what you need to. Blame me if it helps you sleep at night. But I know what you did, and nothing you say will ever make it right. He turned and started walking toward his car, his footsteps crunching over the gravel. She called his name, a hint of desperation in her voice, but he didn't turn around. He didn't trust himself to. For a moment, he thought of driving somewhere far away, disappearing into the night where he wouldn't have to think, wouldn't have to feel. But he knew that wouldn't solve anything. So instead, he drove to a quiet park, pulling into an empty lot and sitting there, staring out at the darkening trees, letting the silence sink in around him. The betrayal cut deep, deeper than he'd imagined possible. But what hurt most was the realization that they'd both let each other down, in different ways. Maybe he had worked too much, maybe he had lost sight of what mattered. But he had never betrayed her trust. He had always been there, even when he wasn't physically present. As he sat there, alone in the stillness of the night, he found himself wondering if there was anything left to salvage, or if they had already drifted too far apart. In the days that followed, Jack and Susan kept their distance, each retreating into their own corners of the house. Conversations became scarce, just passing exchanges filled with tension and unspoken words. It was clear that whatever thin thread had once held them together was fraying, stretched to the breaking point. Jack didn't know if he wanted to save their marriage, or if he was even capable of forgiveness after everything that had happened. But his mind wasn't just on Susan anymore. His thoughts kept circling back to Ryan, the man next door who had crossed a line that couldn't be uncrossed. Jack couldn't deny that part of him wanted revenge. The idea of confronting Ryan had crossed his mind more than once, but there was something about the man that left him uneasy, a smug confidence that bordered on arrogance. And as the days went by, Jack began to notice things. Subtle but unmistakable signs that Ryan hadn't simply moved on. One afternoon, as Jack was coming home, he saw Ryan's car parked on the street, unusually close to his driveway. Ryan was standing outside, casually talking to a couple of neighbors, but his eyes flicked up when Jack got out of his car, and there was something unsettling in his gaze. A smirk lingered on his face, almost like a challenge. Jack forced himself to ignore it, heading inside with a tense nod, but he couldn't shake the feeling that Ryan's interest in Susan hadn't faded. If anything, it seemed to have deepened. That night, as Jack lay awake, he heard the faint sound of a car engine idling outside. He sat up, his senses on high alert, and peered out the bedroom window. There it was, Ryan's car, parked across the street, the silhouette of a figure inside barely visible in the dim light. Jack's pulse quickened, anger and suspicion blending into a restless energy that left him unable to sleep. What was Ryan doing here, in the middle of the night, lurking outside his house? The following morning, Jack decided to confront Susan. They couldn't keep pretending everything was normal while Ryan continued to lurk around, a constant reminder of the affair that had shattered their marriage. "Have you seen him around?" Jack asked, his tone carefully controlled. Susan glanced up from her coffee, her eyes wary. "Who?" "Ryan. I saw him parked outside last night," Jack said, watching her reaction closely. Susan looked down, her expression troubled. "He's probably just, I don't know, maybe he's checking up on us." "He's worried." "Worried?" Jack's voice rose in disbelief. "Susan, he's the one who caused all of this, and now he's just hanging around, acting like he's entitled to what? To you? To our lives?" She was quiet, her fingers tracing the edge of her coffee cup. "I told him it was over, Jack. He knows that. But he doesn't take rejection well." Jack felt a chill run down his spine. "What do you mean?" Susan looked away, her voice barely above a whisper. "He's persistent, Jack. I tried to end things a few times, but he wouldn't listen. He kept coming around, making excuses to see me, calling at all hours. I thought he'd finally backed off, but—" Jack clenched his jaw, fighting to contain his anger. "You should have told me this sooner, Susan. This isn't just a fling. This is dangerous." She nodded, her face pale. "I know. I just didn't think it would go this far." That afternoon, Jack made up his mind to confront Ryan. He waited until he saw him outside, casually washing his car in the driveway, as if everything was perfectly normal. Jack approached him, his strides purposeful, fists clenched at his sides. Ryan looked up, a slow smile spreading across his face as if he'd been expecting him. "Hey, Jack. What's up?" "Let's cut the games, Ryan," Jack said, his voice hard. "You need to back off. Whatever you thought was going on with Susan, it's over. You understand?" Ryan chuckled, leaning back against his car, his gaze unwavering. "Back off? Funny, Jack. I don't remember you being in charge of her decisions. If she doesn't want to see me, that's her choice." "It is her choice," Jack replied, holding his ground. "And she's made it. So stop showing up here. Stop calling her." Ryan's smirk faded, and something darker flashed in his eyes. "You know, Jack, maybe she wouldn't have been so lonely if you'd actually been there for her." Jack felt a surge of rage, his fists tightening, but he forced himself to stay calm. "Whatever issues we had, that doesn't give you a free pass to mess with our lives. Stay away from her." For a moment, they just stood there, a tense silence hanging between them, each man refusing to back down. Ryan's gaze was unblinking, challenging, and Jack realized with a sinking feeling that Ryan wasn't going to let this go. He was obsessed, determined to keep a hold on Susan, no matter the cost. As Jack walked away, his mind raced with thoughts of what to do next. Confronting Ryan directly hadn't helped. If anything, it had only made things worse. He could feel the weight of Ryan's gaze on his back, a constant reminder that this wasn't over. Not by a long shot. That night, as he sat alone, Jack considered his options. He knew that Ryan wasn't going to disappear quietly. Whatever his next move would be, it would be something calculated, something dangerous. And Jack knew he needed to be ready. In that moment, he made a silent vow. He would protect his home, his life, and whatever was left of his marriage. And if Ryan pushed him any further, he'd be ready to do whatever it took to end this twisted game, once and for all. Jack's sense of dread only grew in the days that followed his confrontation with Ryan. The warnings had done nothing. If anything, Ryan's presence seemed to loom even larger. Every time Jack caught sight of him, mowing his lawn, taking out his trash, even just standing outside smoking in the evening, there was an air of smugness about him, a silent taunt. Jack began to wonder just how far Ryan would go to keep Susan in his life. One evening, as Jack pulled into his driveway after a long day at work, he noticed a familiar figure near his porch. It was Susan, standing there with her arms crossed, her face etched with worry. She looked like she had been waiting for him, and the sight of her unsettled him. "Jack," she started, her voice trembling slightly. "I got a call today. From Ryan." He was furious. Jack's fists clenched instinctively, a flash of anger mingling with concern. "What did he say?" "He said," she hesitated, glancing around as if afraid someone might hear. "He said that if I didn't come see him again, he'd make things difficult for you. He mentioned your car, your job." It sounded like a threat, Jack. Jack felt a surge of protectiveness flare up, but beneath it was a sickening feeling of helplessness. He'd seen men like Ryan before, men who didn't understand boundaries, who saw women as prizes and obstacles as mere annoyances. Confronting him hadn't worked, and ignoring him seemed to have emboldened him. Now, it seemed, he was escalating. "Look, Susan, this has gone too far," Jack said, his voice resolute. "If he's threatening us, we need to report it. He can't get away with this." Susan shook her head, a fearful expression crossing her face. "You don't understand. Reporting him could make it worse. He has connections in town. He's well known. I don't want this to spiral out of control, Jack." Jack felt a pulse of frustration, but he knew she was probably right. Ryan was cunning and had already shown he wasn't afraid to play dirty. But he also couldn't stand by while Ryan continued to haunt their lives, poisoning every attempt they made at peace. That night, as they sat together in tense silence, Jack's mind raced with possibilities. He needed a way to protect them, to show Ryan that he couldn't control their lives. They could change the locks, install more cameras, maybe even get a restraining order. But each idea felt inadequate, a temporary fix against someone as determined as Ryan. Then, as if to mock him, his phone buzzed with an unknown number. He hesitated, feeling a chill run down his spine, before answering. A voice greeted him, smooth and chillingly familiar. "Evening, Jack." Jack's breath caught. "Ryan," he muttered, barely managing to keep his voice steady. "What do you want?" "Oh, just a friendly call. Wanted to remind you that if you don't keep your little wife in check, there might be consequences. Think of it as a friendly warning." Jack felt the blood drain from his face, his grip on the phone tightening. "You stay away from her. You hear me? This is over." Ryan chuckled, a dark sound that sent a shiver down Jack's spine. "Over? Oh, Jack, you don't get it. I decide when it's over. And if you don't want things to get messy, I suggest you keep that in mind." The line went dead, leaving Jack standing there, his heart pounding with anger, fear, and a sense of helplessness he hadn't felt in years. He hung up, his hands shaking, his mind consumed by the darkness of Ryan's threat. This was more than a twisted obsession. It was a dangerous fixation, one that threatened everything Jack held dear. In that moment, Jack realized that the only way to end this was to find a way to outsmart Ryan, to beat him at his own game. Jack couldn't shake the venom of Ryan's words from his mind. His threat lingered, a constant reminder that Ryan wasn't finished. For the next few days, Jack moved cautiously, watching his every step, his every action, double-checking locks, surveying the street for any sign of Ryan's presence. He'd had enough of feeling cornered, of letting Ryan dictate his life through intimidation and fear. And though Susan remained distant, they both understood that their safety now hinged on whatever steps Jack took next. One night, unable to sleep, Jack sat in the dim light of his living room, his mind racing through every possibility. There was a single thought that had been gnawing at him for days, a plan he knew was dangerous and potentially reckless. But the more he thought about it, the more he realized it was the only option. Ryan was relentless, obsessed. The only way to stop him was to expose him, to catch him in the act. The next morning, Jack began putting his plan into motion. He didn't tell Susan. He knew she'd try to talk him out of it, and there wasn't time to explain the depths of his resolve. Instead, he told her he was going away on a business trip for a few days, a routine excuse he hoped would reach Ryan's ears. Jack knew Ryan wouldn't be able to resist an opportunity to approach Susan alone, to try to convince her to return to him. It was exactly what Jack was counting on. He placed a new hidden camera in the living room, aimed perfectly to capture every inch of the space. This time, he linked the camera directly to his phone, enabling him to watch in real time, ready to intervene if things went too far. It was risky, and it made Jack's skin crawl to think of leaving Susan vulnerable like this. But he couldn't think of any other way. He needed evidence, undeniable proof that Ryan was not only harassing them but threatening their safety. Jack left just before dawn, parking his car a few blocks away and setting up in an old, empty lot with a view of their house. From here, he'd be close enough to intervene if things escalated, but far enough away to keep his presence hidden. He watched the house, every second stretching into an agonizing eternity, his nerves frayed with anticipation. Hours passed. Susan moved about the house, doing her best to keep up with her normal routine. Jack saw her check her phone, her face troubled as she likely wondered where he really was. He wished he could reassure her, tell her that this was all for their protection, but he needed her reaction to be genuine. She was the bait, and he hated himself for it, but it was the only way. Finally, around midday, Jack's phone buzzed. He glanced at the camera feed and saw Ryan's figure approaching the house, his expression determined, his movements calculated. Jack's pulse quickened as he watched Ryan approach the front door, pausing to glance around the empty street before ringing the doorbell. Susan answered, surprise flashing across her face before she quickly masked it with calm. "What are you doing here, Ryan?" she asked, her voice steady, but Jack could hear the tension beneath her words. Ryan smiled, a smug, self-assured grin that made Jack's blood boil. "Oh, just checking in. I heard Jack was out of town. Thought you might need some company." Jack's fists tightened as he watched, holding himself back from storming in. He needed Ryan to reveal his intentions, to slip up and expose himself. "Ryan, it's over," Susan said, her voice firm. "I told you before, I don't want anything to do with you. Please, just leave." But Ryan didn't move. Instead, he stepped closer, his expression darkening. "Susan, we both know you don't mean that. You wanted this as much as I did, and you know you're not safe with Jack. He doesn't understand you like I do." Susan took a step back, her fear evident as she looked toward the door, hoping he would just leave. But Ryan reached out, grabbing her arm, his voice dropping to a threatening whisper. "You're not going anywhere, Susan. You're mine. You always have been." Jack's patience snapped. He couldn't sit and watch any longer. He threw open his car door, sprinting toward the house with adrenaline surging through his veins. He burst through the front door, and Ryan whirled around, his face twisting in shock and anger. "Let her go," Jack growled, his voice steady but filled with a fury he hadn't known he possessed. Ryan released Susan, his mouth curving into a sneer. "So, the big protector finally shows up. What are you gonna do, Jack? Call the cops?" "You have nothing." Jack stepped forward, meeting his gaze. "Actually, I do. Everything you just did, everything you just said, it's all recorded. Every threat, every disgusting word." Ryan's face fell, his confidence evaporating as he realized the trap he'd walked into. Jack watched as the smugness drained from his eyes, replaced with fear. "You're finished," Jack said, his voice quiet but resolute. In the days following Ryan's arrest, the house finally felt quiet again. Jack could breathe without the shadow of Ryan lurking in every corner, without the tension that had twisted their home into a place of suspicion and fear. The police had taken his threats seriously, especially with the video evidence. It was enough to secure a restraining order and pending charges, and for the first time in months, Jack felt a glimmer of relief. But the relief came with a strange emptiness. The marriage he'd once fought so hard for now felt foreign, scarred by betrayal, pain, and the sense that they had lost something irreplaceable. Susan moved carefully around him, as if afraid to break whatever fragile piece remained between them. She'd apologized many times, her voice choked with guilt and remorse. But Jack wasn't sure if forgiveness was something he could give, or if he even wanted to. One evening, as they sat together in the dimly lit living room, Susan broke the silence. "Jack, I know I've hurt you more than I can ever fix," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "And I understand if you can't forgive me, but I just want you to know, I'm truly sorry. For everything." Jack looked at her, taking in the sadness in her eyes, the regret etched into every line of her face. There was a time when her pain would have softened him, but now, it felt like they were two strangers, each holding pieces of a broken past. "I know, Susan," he replied quietly, "and maybe one day, I can forgive you. But I think we both know that we can't go back to how things were." She nodded, a single tear tracing down her cheek. "Maybe it's time for both of us to find what we need apart." They sat in silence, the finality of her words settling over them like a gentle, inevitable weight. It wasn't angry or bitter. It was simply the realization that their journey together had reached its end. They'd fought for something they couldn't reclaim, and now it was time to let go. A week later, Jack watched as Susan packed her things, their home quiet and somber. When she finally closed the door behind her, he felt a pang of loss, but also a strange sense of peace. He stood alone in the empty living room, the weight lifting from his shoulders. As Jack looked out the window, he felt a glimmer of something new, hope. A new beginning, however uncertain, was finally within reach.